So because I've been running around, I didn't realize that such a general public audience would be here. I thought I'd be introducing it to the fellows, so I'm going to take out all of the in-jokes. Yeah, I know. Sorry. So first off, I wanted to thank Adam for honoring me with this introduction tonight, and I want to thank you all for forgiving me this introduction, which will be conducted without recourse to PowerPoint. You can just imagine me naked instead. And please forgive also the slapdash nature of these remarks. I wrote all of these on trains. This is train literature. Adam Ross was born in New York City in 1967 and converted to the religion of Southernism in 1995. He was a child actor, a state champion wrestler, a responsible male presence at 2 majority female institutions of higher education, and is now the author of 2 books, the acclaimed novel Mr. Peanut and the acclaimed collection of stories, Ladies and Gentlemen. He has written both fiction and nonfiction for the usual prestigious American publications, but is perhaps best known to us, or to some of us, as the husband of Beth and the father of Margot and Lila. These books and these relationships mark him out as an American writer. Now, American writers have not had much to complain about compared to their peers from other countries, but that hasn't stopped them, of course. Through all the moanings and groanings and gripes, though, the one that really rings true is fundamental. The American writer is almost never allowed to be an American writer. Or he or she hasn't been allowed since the mass European and Russian immigrations to America around the turn of the 20th century. Since then, the American writer has increasingly become the Jewish American writer, the African American writer, and even the native-born would come to be labeled by the hyphenated culture workers of the American media as WASP chroniclers of a half-illusory, half-very-real establishment. So the American writer can maybe only be an American writer abroad. What seems most American, though, most singularly American about the work of Adam Ross is its sociability. And I realized this by reading him here, by speaking with him here, and by being here with all of you at the Academy. What I mean is that the history of 20th century European literature seems to be one of understandable alienation. So many books, and you can name your favorites or least favorites yourselves, but so many books are concerned with the individual, the alienated individual, the lone voice, the underground man, Joseph K., Marceau, Malloy, Malone, the unnamable, people cut off from their societies, howling in the wilderness by dint of politics or personal choice, or some acute psychologically dissociative combination of the two. This has not been the American situation, which has always had a fiction of being surrounded by people, being of people, not just family and friends, but strangers who, through processes of acculturation, become both. Now I realize that not only is this a dangerous generalization, but also that I'm delivering this generalization to an audience of scholars, whose task in life it is to parse lazy, misty abstractions, such as mine, from the particular, the pith. But I ask you to consider this. We are currently in a social situation. Now, we are all, and this was for the scholars, maybe everyone else, we are all lonely workers in lonely disciplines, in disciplines that might have little in common, because scholars deal in facts, and Adam writes his own facts. And yet, we all meet and are relieved by meeting at these meals and discussions and so on. The Academy has made us social animals, a bit, and that is perhaps its most American quality. The fiction of Adam Ross has a similar concern and similar effect. It talks about how marriage is made of selves and changes selves. It talks about a man alone with his own thoughts, and then about the same man who will not be left alone by parents, by children, by jobs, by the world. And it shows this man testing his thoughts against them all, and through that testing, realizing that stark adult border where aspirations and hopes and dreams are no longer enough, where what counts is action out there off the page. There have been very few writers whose books so compel me to keep reading, and yet so compel me to go out and live it up, be among people, to ask myself and you, as Alice asks David in Mr. Peanut, quote, why not dedicate our lives to living in every one of the United States, to eradicating world hunger, raising free-range chickens in the French countryside. How about we become marine biologists and study the Great Barrier Reef? How about we hike the Appalachian Trail? So that's from page 277 of the copy of Mr. Peanut that Adam donated to the Academy Library. The copy I borrowed to refresh my memory of his work. When I got to that page, I found it bookmarked with 4 checks from the Tennessee Bank. The First Tennessee Bank. They are blank checks, which I now return to Adam, among the smartest, funniest, and most generous American writers I know.
Drinks on me. That's what I'm talking about. Thank you, Josh. We will take this on the road. In the spirit of the Lego movie, thank you to the Academy, blah, blah, backstory, blah, blah, blah. Thank you to the Academy. It's been so awesome being here. Everything Josh described is true. This is a remarkable group of fellows and just a great group of people to be around. It makes taking breaks a little too much fun. I'm going to just read. I'm going to read the beginning of the novel, which is very short, but it sets up the novel, and that way I can limit my introductory remarks because I'm going to jump ahead. It's called Playworld. In the fall of 1980, when I was 13, a friend of my parents named Naomi Shaw fell in love with me. She was 36, a mother of 2, and married to a wealthy man. Like so many things that happened to me that year, it didn't seem strange at the time. 2 decades later, when I finally told my mother about this, we were taking a walk on the beach. She stopped, stunned, and said, "But she was such an ugly woman." The remark wasn't as petty as it sounds, but closer to objective fact, which didn't mean I ever considered Naomi to be bad-looking. If I was aware of it then, it neither repulsed nor affected my feelings for her. It was just a thing I took for granted, like the color of her hair. This was one of her more memorable attributes. Wiry and ashen, it had the shadings, but not the shimmer of pigeon's feathers. Naomi kept it long, so that it fell past her shoulders, a witch's width, whose texture was dry as tinder and springy as brush. I knew it by touch, for my face was often buried in it. Only later did I wonder if she considered herself unattractive, because she always wore Porsche sunglasses, the gold frames so large they looked more like a visor with blue-tinted prescription lenses. When we were driving together, which was often that year, she'd allow these to slide down her nose and look at me over their bridge like a librarian. She might have considered this pose winning, but was more likely to see me better. Her mouth hung open. Her lower teeth were uneven, and her tongue, pressing against them, brined in her spittle, which always tasted of coffee. The next thing I recall about Naomi is her car. It was a silver Mercedes sedan, 300 SD, along with turbo diesel nickel-plated on the back that rattled like a bus while idling, but made a deep hum when it drove. The interior, enormous in my mind's eye, was tricked out with glossy wood paneling and white leather, back seats so wide and legroom so ample it made the driver appear to be far away. It was in this car that Naomi and I talked most often. We'd park, and then she'd lean across the armrest to press her cheek to mine, and I'd sometimes allow her to kiss me. Other times, we'd move to the back, lying there, while Naomi nuzzled my neck. I'd stare at the ceiling's dotted insulation until the pattern seemed to detach and then drift like a starry sky. This car was her prized possession, And like many commuters, she turned the machine into an extension of her body. Her left thumb lightly hooked the wheel at 8 o'clock when traffic was moving, her fingertips sliding to 11 when it was slow. She liked to sit slightly reclined, her right elbow propped on the rest, her hand spread on her inner thigh, though after she lost her pinky that summer, and even after being fitted with a prosthesis, she kept it tucked away. I worried you'd think it was disgusting, she said, the digit sandwiched between the bucket seat and her hip. Not at all. She'd bought herself a diamond ring to hide the seam, and for the most part, the likeness was uncanny, but at certain angles, you could tell the silicone was rubbery, the cuticles lined too smooth, the nails pale crescent, too creamy to match the others, like my father's fake teeth, which he often left lying around our apartment. I was fascinated by it, though my curiosity wasn't morbid. I was a child actor, you see, a student of all forms of dissembling, and had long ago found my greatest subject to be adults. Okay, so. So that's the beginning, and I'll leave now, because there's nowhere to go but down. But anyway, so, you know, we're here in Berlin, and I've seen a lot of unbelievable PowerPoints. And so I thought I'd go simple. I just want to direct our German friends who don't know who these people are, because some of them will be mentioned. That is Herman Munster of the show The Munsters, which is a show about a family of monsters, right? There's nothing else you need to know except that's what he looks like. That's Anthony Quinn, the famous actor. I mention Anthony Quinn because this is an autobiographical novel. My father was Anthony Quinn's voice coach in 1964. My father is an actor. And Quinn took my mother and father with him on their honeymoon, or as their honeymoon. He dragged them around Europe on what really gives new luster to the term ego trip. But anyway, he took them with him while he was buying lots of art, painting lots of paintings, buying furniture, and also getting his bastard son baptized at St. Peter's. Anyway, so you need to know about him. That's Lincoln Towers, where I grew up, one step up from the projects. I've literally lived in Lincoln Towers nearly all my life except for 2 years, but Lincoln Towers, and my architect friends in the room will appreciate its stultifying sameness and near barracks-like quality. I'll be talking about that a bit. That, of course, is the Colonnade to the Manhattan Bridge, which is a very interesting thing, a very interesting view in Manhattan, because you see Canal and Bowery is kind of low down. And it's one of the only places in Manhattan where when you're looking up at the Colonnade, all you see is sky, which is a rare view in New York. And then those are the Japanese gods, Fujin and Raijin. The thunder god on the left, those are his drums. And that's the god of wind on the right. And if I go any further with this PowerPoint, there's going to be some dirty pictures, and I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to jump ahead. I'm going to jump ahead in this novel. So let me tell you where we are. It doesn't really need much setup. Griffin, our child actor, has just met Naomi at a anniversary celebration for the whole family's psychologist. The whole family is in therapy, which was very common when I was a kid. We all had the same psychotherapist, which maybe explains why I'm here in Germany. I mean, I think really all you need to know, besides the fact that the father is also an actor, is that this guy, Al Moretti, has just given a wildly inappropriate toast, okay? And he's what we call in America a Jewapi, which means he's half Jewish, half Italian. He's a Jewapi. I'm a Jewapi. You know, he's one of these guys. He would always say this too, is to have to explain his behavior. Like, I'm a Jewapi. That's why I am what I am, you know? I don't think you really need to know anything else. Here we go. I'll read for about 35 minutes, okay? My family had known Al Moretti for as long as I could remember. He and his former lover, Neil, were our down-the-hall neighbors at Lincoln Towers, a residential complex on Manhattan's Upper West Side that was an agglomeration of nondescript, gray brick high-rises, nearly identical in dimension and design, each 29 stories tall, if you've subtracted the absent 13th floor. In color, they were a bit sandier and brighter than cinder block. Occasionally, the sunset turned them to gold. The higher floors enjoyed spectacular views of the Hudson River, but not our north-facing fifth-floor apartment, which overlooked a parking lot and a sliver of West End Avenue. The complex boasted luxury amenities, manicured grounds, 24-hour doormen, and a security force. But while these distinguished them from the even more depressing Amsterdam houses several blocks south where the blacks lived, Lincoln Towers felt only slightly different in kind to me than those projects. It was only at the complex's northernmost edge, above 70th Street, that West End Avenue took on its legendary character. Here, the occasional steeple or cupola-topped walk-up abutted buildings with rusticated limestone facades or terracotta trim, these blackened by car exhaust, desperately in need of sandblasting, but magnificent despite the grime. Their ironwork was inset with decorative lions or tritons, and their awnings, tautly snapping in the gusts, reminded me of expensive kites. Their entryways, meanwhile, offered glimpses into their marble-floored lobbies, where a plush couch and wingback chair might be set beneath a 19th century landscape painting, a pack of borzoi coursing a fox, say, or a wounded stag, as if it were a rich man's smoking room, instead of a place to wait before the doorman permitted you upstairs. These were decidedly unlike our building's high-ceilinged lobby, its far wall covered with an ugly mosaic figure, gigantic as a stegosaur, but so nebulous in shape that it resisted any of my imaginative attempts to morph it into something animal, vegetable, or mineral. Our hallway was 2 bowling alleys long and just as narrow, its floors gray-green tiles giving off a hue similar to a neglected aquarium. Walking down ours was like spinning a radio dial, for as I passed each apartment's heavy steel door, I'd catch auditory snippets of our neighbors' lives, the Von Wurzels practicing their harps, or Miss Kapner's Chihuahua's angry yap. In Al and Neil's case, this was often shouting, and when things got really bad, the sound of a flung plate shattering or furniture being smashed. Still, no matter how viciously they'd fought, Al always made a single-knuckled knock at our door afterward, 3 gentle taps, as if to apologize for the ruckus. "Lily," he'd ask my mother before she'd answered, "Are you there?" I made it a point to get a look at Al after these beatings. His fat lip, the result of one brawl, swelled until its underside was exposed. After another scuffle, his plum-colored eyelid glistened so brightly it looked shellacked. Once he showed up bleeding from above his hairline, the vital fluid spidering across his brows to run over his nose and dribble around his chin. He pressed his palm to his forehead to staunch it, but the wound leaked in rivulets so fast-moving it was as if he'd squeezed a soaked sponge over his crown. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said to my mother, then shut his eyes in shame before she took his elbow and led him into the dining room to clean him up. When she was done, she poured him a stiff drink, and they spoke in hushed tones. Rather, it was Al who rambled, sobbing occasionally, while my mother, who was naturally reticent, listened with her chin in hand, patiently waiting while he talked himself into leaving Neil once and for all. When Mom urged him to stay the night, Al said, "I can't impose." But then he stood shakily and made his way toward the couch. Maybe I just put my head down till I get unfuckcocked. I liked to take a peek at Al, outstretched on our living room sofa, whose fold-out bed he refused to avail himself of. He lay there like Gulliver. All adult pain seemed gigantic to me, one arm draped over his eyes, his highball's rim held in his free hand, its base leaving a circle of condensation on the floor whenever he lifted it to his trembling lips and loudly sipped his vodka on the rocks as if it were hot tea. He was always gone before I woke the next morning. It was surprising that Neil was able to deal out such punishment, being markedly shorter than Al. True, he was stockier, but in person, he was so soft-spoken and gentle, he almost seemed demure, Ernie to Al's Bert. Neil had a G.I. Joe mustache and beard that I considered more apparatus than facial hair, as if integral to the workings of his jaw, and enormous gray eyes, so wide-set they gave the illusion of moving independently. Once or twice a week, Mom had the couple over for martinis, Al excusing himself after the second round to get a bottle of wine from their apartment, and briefly leaving her and Neil alone. He seemed so indrawn and still sitting there, his hands clasped on his lap or tucked beneath his biceps, that it was impossible to imagine him enraged. He was one of the rare people able to draw my mother out, and in Al's absence, their getting along thus almost felt like a betrayal. Though the truth was, I favored Neil, whereas Al was never afraid to correct or reprimand Orrin and me in our parents' presence, and often failed to keep our names straight when he told us to shut up. Neil always greeted us with interest, or actually looked at the drawings we showed him. And if my mother had to run to the store, she occasionally left us with him. Neil was a dealer in Far Eastern art. He owned a midtown gallery, but also did a great deal of business from home. His apartment was an oriental menagerie whose paintings, silk screens, and religious sculptures were to me like the couple's ferocious alter egos. Hydra-headed Naga, the snake goddess, emerging from a dragon's mouth like a stream of Al's profanity. Fanged Kali, her enormous tongue stuck out, a trident and scimitar in hand, and poor Al, I imagined, pinned like Shiva beneath Neil's foot. Boar-toothed Raijin, the Japanese thunder god, whose puck-sized drums orbited him as he squared off against Fujin, shouldering his bag of winds. Are they enemies? I asked Neil, as we regarded the two-paneled screen. Companions, Neil said. And then in a moment of Vulcan mind meld, he shrugged sheepishly and added, "They make a lot of noise." Upon which we both laughed. To pass our time together, Neil liked to read me stories from the New English Bible. He was especially fond of Exodus and the book of Judges, but mostly we blazed through the adventures of King David and his tussles with Saul, whose spear-throwing at his adopted son I found strangely upsetting. "Do you trust your parents?" Neil once asked me after concluding a chapter. Before I could respond to that odd question, he apologized, adding, "Please don't tell them I said that," which I didn't. The corner apartment was the floor's only 3-bedroom, and upon first getting a tour, my father had remarked to Neil, with his typical unwitting bluntness, "If you ever decide to move, let us know." But it was our family who moved first. My initial memories of that terrible event follow a very clear sequence. It was a Sunday evening, the one day of the week my father was home. He'd been touring with the Fisher King then, his first Abe Fountain musical, the one about King Arthur. After the Sunday matinee, he caught a train from Philadelphia or D.C., only to depart the following evening. "The house is dark on Monday," he'd explain, as if the theater were his home and the cast his family. Our parents were in their bedroom when Orrin and I snuck out of ours. On the living room's coffee table, beside an empty wine glass, were several lit candles my mother had left out. I took the holder by its knob and, stretching it before me like Ebenezer Scrooge, led Orrin into our front hall closet, a cave, I told him upon entering. The jackets above us, stalactites. I was mad for games of pretend. When I raised the candle to illuminate these clothes, it detonated some dry cleaning's plastic. At least it sounded like an explosion, since the fire consumed it so fast it popped, instantly igniting the coat beneath it, the jacket as magically visible amidst the flames as Moses' burning bush. We ran to our room and hid behind the bed. "It's a fire," I told Orrin, "a real fire." When we couldn't stand it any longer, we hurried to alert our parents, who at first tried to calm us, but suddenly smelling smoke, did something remarkable, because never before seen, they ran. At this point, my recollections grow jumbled. I saw my mother near the foyer, separated from me by a wall of flames. "Shell," she screamed to my father, "get the pail." I was sure she meant the plastic bucket that I took to the beach, the orange one with the white handle and my name written on it in black marker. But suddenly we were fleeing the apartment. I was borne aloft, my father yanking my wrist above my head and carrying me in such a fashion that I occasionally touched down, moonwalking. My foot stamped a patch of flame on the entryway rug, but didn't burn. We were in the lobby next. Some significant period of time had passed. For now it was filled with evacuated tenants, all of us watching the firemen unhurriedly file in and march up the stairs wearing oxygen tanks and carrying axes while the smoke crawled along the ceiling's recessed lights. I was in my father's arms. He was wearing a bathrobe, the one with brown and black stripes, his only article of clothing to survive the blaze. All I could think, even at 5, while I held his neck, was me. I did this. But I don't want to mischaracterize this event. It certainly wasn't a tragedy, a 5-alarm fire in which no one was seriously hurt. Our cat died from smoke inhalation, not that I, at the tender age of 5, cared much about the cat. We did lose a great deal of property, clothing, furniture, jewelry, the paintings of several artist friends that my father never failed to remind me might have become valuable one day. Not that I was old enough to be permanently attached to anything material. As for any trauma I suffered, that came a week later. This involved my parents' insurance company, a saga that pointed to several important discrepancies, more like blank spots, between the memories I've described and my mother and father's version of events. Apparently, Orrin and I didn't rush to tell our parents about the blaze. They smelled the smoke first and found us hiding in our room, then deposited us in the bathtub, running the water while they tried to put out the fire. And while I can't believe I don't remember this comparatively calm, incongruous pause in that conflagration, the fact is that I don't. My mother filled pots in the kitchen and, racing between the sink and entryway like a pioneer woman, futilely tried to douse the flames. My father, meanwhile, rushed to the stairwell. Giant fire extinguishers were installed on each landing, but when he returned to the apartment with the tank and twisted its handle to engage it, the hose sputtered uselessly, foam dribbling from its nozzle like an empty can of shaving cream. The blaze was out of control by then, and conceding the defeat, my father raced downstairs. All of this is much less interesting than what happened afterward. Al and Neil were kind enough to let us move into their place. My parents had a $10,000 insurance policy and filed the claim. Ironically, the agent handling it was named Nick Salvatore. My parents met him in the lobby for the apartment's inspection. This young man memorable for many reasons, but to my mother because of his heart-stopping good looks. He had all the classic traits of beautiful Italian men, from his curly, squid ink colored hair to the amber buttered hue of his skin, which made his teeth appear whiter when he smiled. His clothes, too, were perfect. He wore a camel hair coat over his black suit, a white shirt and dark tie, funereal colors, my mother thought, entirely appropriate given what had befallen them, but with beacon-bright accents, the shirt and overcoat, for he was here to help, after all. But what made her swoon were his hands, which she took when they greeted, something about their size and squareness, the hard angles of his thumb's metacarpal bones, and the pronounced indented triangle where they joined the wrist, made her desire take flight and then burst inside her chest like a firework. She was a deeply loyal person, incapable of infidelity, and yet it took all of her self-control not to turn to my father and say, "Why don't you go find something else to do?" Salvatore couldn't have been older than 25, and while my parents rode the elevator with him to their devastated apartment, she was transported back to Rome, to her honeymoon, the afternoon she had to herself after the movie star Anthony Quinn, who had brought them along to Europe so my father could continue as his voice coach, had decamped with Shell to play tennis, a daily ritual that always ended with the pair eating lunch so late it pushed back dinner until nearly midnight. Come midday, when boredom and exhaustion had overwhelmed her, she fled their stuffy hotel room, abandoning her typewriter and Quinn's rambling, recorded dictation. She was transcribing his autobiography. To find somewhere to eat first, and then window shop a little, killing the rest of the afternoon at a cafe with a book and a carafe of wine. This was followed by an early evening siesta that left her bright-eyed for the endless dinners, which she was bathed and dressed for long before Shell and Quinn returned. During these several-hour jaunts through Trastevere or Prati, Foro Romano or Via del Corso, she was often accosted by such similarly gorgeous men walking Rome's streets, singly or in packs, their English poor, but for the most obvious blandishments, "pretty lady" or "my beauty." It was at these moments that she suffered neither temptation to stray nor regret at her newly betrothed state, but something far sharper and more crushing because it was an emotion entirely new to her. She felt alone in her marriage. Standing there in the lobby, my father also had a strong reaction to Salvatore's appearance. Why, he thought, were such movie star good looks wasted on an insurance salesman? Why couldn't he have been so similarly blessed? Not with those WAP features, obviously. They only got you bit parts in gangland flicks, as one of the trench-coated, fedora-wearing, Tommy gun-carrying foot soldiers. But instead of his own Easter Island face, enormous, from chin to crown, as long as a canoe, with a brow so tall it made him appear as hammer-headed as Herman Munster, "You remind me," said one asshole casting agent, "of a Jewish Fred Gwynn." Why couldn't he have been gifted with a mug more symmetrical, proportional, classically American? To Lily, Salvatore said, "Mrs. Hurt, I'm sorry for your loss, but I promise Nationwide is on your side. We're going to take care of your family." My father had immediately noticed Lily's reaction to Salvatore, her already severe shyness so intensified by his presence that she was not only rendered speechless, but kept her lowered eyes focused on the agent's hand. Her attraction to him was so obvious, an obviousness so closely akin to a poor performance, that my father couldn't bear to watch. Unfortunately, the shift in his attention made him suddenly aware of the tenants coming to and fro, all of whom shot him looks at once accusatory and pitying, incriminating glances that made him wince inwardly. There they were, he imagined them thinking, the pyromaniac's parents. Surprisingly, Lily grew talkative the moment they got on the elevator, and by the time they'd arrived at the apartment's door, she not only recounted to Salvatore the whole disaster, but confessed to a lingering sense of guilt for leaving out the candles. "I don't know how I could have been so thoughtless," she said. Salvatore pressed his hand to her shoulder, and although he rubbed it hurriedly, like he might his fat aunts, so far as Shell was concerned, he rested it there a little too long upon stopping. "Oh, come on, Mrs. Hurt. You're being too hard on yourself," he said. "Come on already. What about it? What if one of the children had been hurt," she said, "or worse?" Lily was crying now, and Shell was relieved. Becalmed, confident, her beauty was imperious, what with her swan's neck and bright cat eyes. However, upset, her features collapsed like a shrunken apple's. The transformation seemed to cool Salvatore down. Thankfully, neither of them was, he noted. "I rushed the kids to bed," she continued, all awash. "I left dishes in the sink and those stupid candles on the table. Shell had been gone all week, and I just wanted us to have some time alone." What was she going to tell him next? My father wondered. That while they were making love and heard the kids scurrying around, he told her to ignore them? That sooner or later they'd go to sleep? Let's let the man do his job, my father said. Her expression grim, my mother nodded toward the apartment's door. I don't think I can bring myself to go in there, she said. There's no need whatsoever, Salvatore said. Gathering herself, she offered her hand to him once more. Thank you again, Mr. Salvatore. Please, he said. Call me Nick. At this, Lily smiled, then snapped open her purse and found some tissues. Dabbing her eyes with them, she laughed. And the transformation back to her old self was miraculous, her face reconfiguring, her cheeks blooming with color. Salvatore smiled back like an infant mimicking his mom's moon features. I have to go see about an apartment for us uptown, she said. Salvatore waited until the elevator arrived, the moment after its door closed. His face darkened. Let's take a look at this place already, he said to my father. The agent's bad mood persisted through the apartment's inspection, which to Shell seemed perfunctory at best, infuriatingly quick, one of those things a plumber might do upon entering a flooding room, tighten a plug to stop the rushing water's flow, and then charge you $100 for the moment's work. Salvatore seemed put out by having to breathe the smoke damage's overpowering odor, which he further underscored by pinching the tarred clothes and sooted bed linens, and then holding up his index finger in disgust, so that his pitch-black pad was like a failed white-gloved inspection, a sign of messiness instead of ruin. When they were back in the hallway, he finally spoke. Just so I've got this straight, your kid sets the closet on fire, and then your wife tries to put it out while you get the building's extinguisher. But it doesn't work, right? That's correct. Did you keep it? What? The fucking defective, probably never inspected in a million years fire extinguisher. No, of course not. Salvatore shook his head miserably. I'll bet you all the money I got, he continued, that the superintendent's been racing up and down these stairs, checking every last fucking fire extinguisher the second after your kid torched the place. Enough about my son, Shell said. It was an accident. Salvatore rolled his eyes. Tell me why you're not taking these guys to court again, he asked. You're looking at a hell of a lawsuit. But my father shook his head. We have insurance, he managed to say. He'd never considered bringing a negligence claim. For one, he distrusted the process, the lawyers, and the courtroom drama. What if it were all for naught? It was like multiple callbacks for an audition that ended with a producer's rejection. Getting one's hopes up hurt more than the final refusal. This was coupled with his own reluctance to cause a stir, consistent with his actor's disposition, a common flaw in that breed's character, but one my father suffered from acutely, for he saw such relationships as personal, based on more than simply commerce. Sue management successfully, and by recouping his losses, he risked inviting that state of relations most anathema to him. He would be disliked. So what now? My father said. Salvatore shrugged. We got problems. How's that? Perhaps because they were standing in the hallway, Salvatore lowers his voice. Put yourself in my position, he said. I got a client whose kid lights some combustibles, and now he wants me to give him the full amount of his policy? No offense, but it's as if your dog bit me, and I'm the one being asked to pay for its chipped tooth. My father couldn't bring himself to argue. You don't seem like a fine print kind of guy, Mr. Hurt. No offense, but you understand when I say this looks bad. In reply, my father spoke the words he'd wanted to utter from the moment he'd first smelled smoke. I'm sorry. Salvatore sighed. Look, I'm going to get you and your pretty wife your check. He glanced at his watch and then brightened. This afternoon, in fact. Then he slapped the back of his palm against my father's chest and pressed it there. There's something I need you to do for me first. It was brutally cold outside, but especially here, where Broadway and Columbus Avenue intersected, even Lincoln Center's fountains, their jets, almost furry in the January brightness, bent slightly in the prevailing wind, spraying unwitting passerby. The spume steadily sheared off their apex like snow blown from a mountain's peak. Men held the brims of their hats, walking as stiffly as zombies against the blast. Women pulled their scarves over their mouths, the trailing fabric snapping behind them as they leaned forward, or sometimes they even turned their backs to the gale. The only gustier expanse was Columbus Circle, a few blocks down, where the flurries seemed channeled by the GW building and then swirled before the Coliseum's facade, whistling like some maritime squall. Shell would catch the one train there, take it to Grand Central, and then grab the queue downtown to meet Salvatore as planned, but only after he stopped at the bank. "Get started now on your road to riches," my father had said in the commercial, "by saving regularly at the dime, offices in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Long Island." His tone was gentle, reassuring, solid as the FDIC. As the bank's TV spokesperson, they'd given him a complimentary checking and savings account, and Shell couldn't help offhandedly mentioning to the tellers that he was the institution's voice, just so they know who they were dealing with. "Mr. Hurt," said Glenda as he stepped to her window, "are you managing to stay warm out there?" "It's tough," my father said. "What can I do for you today?" "I need to make a withdrawal." Glenda slid him the slip and then folded her hands on the counter. "How much then?" If he hadn't been to the bank last week, he wouldn't have known his balance, $4,100.50. As a habit, he preferred to ignore it, thereby going longer stretches, not tormented by its shabby state, or more recently, to be pleasantly surprised by the amount good money had been rolling in, the weekly checks from the Fisher King, as well as residuals from his Network National ad for American Tourister, the one with the cage-bound gorilla giving all hell to a piece of luggage. "Dear clumsy bellboys," my father had droned in the commercial, "brutal cab drivers, careless doormen, ruthless porters, savage baggage masters, and all the butter-fingered luggage handlers all over the world, have we got a suitcase for you." There was an art to enlivening advertising copy, a jazz musician's sense of rhythm, of where to shorten a syllable or elongate a beat, and when he delivered the tagline, he supplied just the right injection of swagger, as if instead of the suitcase, oh, if only he were the one impervious to harm. "All of it," my father said. At this, Glenda winced. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hurt, but we do ask you maintain at least a $100 balance. Otherwise, you have to pay a penalty." $4,000 then, my father said. "Keep the change." As a courtesy, Glenda laughed at his joke, but she was no fool. She knew that he was in trouble. She must be hyper-attuned, Shell figured, to her patron's tells, this simple job with its brief exchanges of hope and grief, destitution and largesse. Yet even now, he couldn't help it. He briefly stepped out of the moment, committing his own grim expression to memory. "File this away," he urged himself. "Save it for a performance." Salvatore had demanded they meet at the edge of Chinatown, on Canal and Bowery, the district's easternmost corner. It was a madhouse. Apron street vendors stood before their carts, piled high with carrots and bok choy, loudly negotiating with customers. In the restaurant's windows hung rows of glazed piglets and ducks, their hooked bodies shiny and brown, as if dipped in caramel. Here, pedestrian traffic changed, its density fivefold that of Midtown. All the micro allowances to right-of-way were outright ignored by the Chinese, their lack of concessions to flow creating crowded eddies, so slow-moving, Shell was forced to walk turned sideways, or, at the worst bottlenecks, stand completely still. Salvatore had said he'd be in his car, that he would park in front of the Citizens Bank, and this seemed appropriate to my father, for in the shadow of its limestone dome, it was as if a robbery were about to take place, the insurance agent playing both thief and getaway driver. The very sight of the vehicle stopped Shell in his tracks. It was a black Lincoln Continental Mark III. Not so different in design from the model Anthony Quinn had driven in Europe. Its hood similarly long and formidable, its front to rear fenders so tall and pronounced, it reminded Shell of a catamaran. Seeing it, my father was suddenly seized by a memory. He and Lily were driving behind Quinn in their van. This vehicle had struggled to climb hills anyway, but loaded for bear with the movie star's painting supplies and knee-jerk furniture purchases, it had become the little engine that couldn't. They had trailed Quinn's Lincoln all over Europe, from Naples to Rome to Perugia to Venice, from Milan to Biarritz and back, from Genoa along the Ligurian coast to Imperia. But now, most harrowingly, on their journey's final northward push through the Alps to Paris, they drove along the mountainous Col de Torini, its hairpins so sharp it was like a carnival ride. Quinn's Lincoln disappearing behind walls of rock rising into their path, only to reappear far ahead, almost out of view, as if he were flaunting its handling and speed. I am not this man's voice coach, my father realized. I am his Sherpa. This trip would end with them rocketing through the guardrail to plunge into the valley, dying on this fool's errand called their honeymoon. What took you? Salvatore said when Shell got in the car. The insurance agent was eating from a takeout carton, exhibiting impressive facility with his chopsticks. When my father didn't answer, Salvatore tilted the top toward him. You want some, he asked. It's chop suey. My father shook his head. The windows were slightly fogged, but Shell could see the Manhattan Bridge's triumphal arch and colonnade ahead. From where they were parked, its span wasn't visible, nor Brooklyn's low-slung buildings, just sky. In the city, a rare view, like a gate to nowhere. The structure was reminiscent in its pillared horseshoe design of St. Peter's, and overwhelmed by memory yet again, Shell recalled Quinn and his mistress Yolanda standing beneath the Pieta, the priest pouring holy water over their bastard child Francisco. Lily, kneeling on the pew next to Shell, had leaned toward him to whisper, "This is the most profane, ridiculous thing I have ever seen." Salvatore put down the carton. "We gonna do this?" he said. From his breast pocket, my father removed the bank envelope. Salvatore pulled the check and held the paper in the air between his index and middle finger. It was a larger slip than most, as if its additional surface area were necessary to accommodate such a figure, typed in capitals, $10,000 and 0 cents. "I don't understand," my father said. "What?" "The math." "You lost me," Salvatore said. "Of this," my father said, "this transaction." Salvatore smiled. "You wearing a mic or something?" "I'm asking you a question." "Hey, I'm just a courier. You're a goddamn thief." "All right," Salvatore said and nodded. "If that's how you want to play this." Then he reached over to pull the door's latch. My father knocked his arm away. "I give you 4 so that you'll give me 10, he said. "You give me 10, but it's really only 6. Don't fucking touch me. If it's only 6, why not make it that to start? Get out. It doesn't make sense." There followed an exchange. The two men grabbed each other's collars, but the stiff-armed fashion in which they clasped made it appear closer to a pose, this odd embrace, like some foreign country's formal greeting. The pair pressed as far as possible from each other, but deadlocked. The parting did finally come, albeit suddenly and more violently than Shell was prepared, for he was ejected from the car, stumbling backwards, while Salvatore peeled off in a great screech of smoke. This soon cleared to reveal the check, wadded in my father's palm, the slip crumpled there but intact, and his money gone. The fire was no tragedy, as I'd said, though because of it, I suffered a trauma. It occurred the following Sunday. By then, my mother had found us a place uptown on 88th and West End Avenue, this new apartment so much larger than its predecessor that Orrin and I no longer needed to share a room. We were meagerly packed and ready to move from Alan Neal's the next day, but when my father appeared at the door, I somehow knew he'd come for me alone. I ran, hiding beneath the bed, but my father dragged me from by my wrist from its safety. I vividly remember backpedaling with all the strength I had, grabbing a doorknob in passing, a chair, a table's leg. I was as willing to pull my arm from its socket as a lizard to jettison its tail. But it was no use. Exhausted, gone limp, my father gathered me into his arms and carried me down the hallway to our decimated apartment. The keyhole had been knocked out by the firemen, and from its circle sprung pink insulation flecked with soot. He touched the door, and it swung inward easily to reveal the floor was still covered with water. This standing lake, ash and debris flecked, its surreal incongruousness straight out of a nightmare. I was afraid that its black surface hid fall-offs, sharp objects, that he might deposit me in it and leave me there. My father walked me through every room. He pointed out the black streaks climbing to sharp points where flames had licked them, the melted fixtures, our blackened clothes, though most terrifying by far was the stench, this cold must, like the carcass of a drowned dragon. Having come full circle, having finally returned to the front door, my father stopped so that I might take a final look. When he was satisfied the image was indelible, he broke his silence. "Never again," he said to me. Within a year, I made my first television appearance. Thank you.